what is contemporary in the visual arts?
Contemporary, what is contemporary in the visual arts? It's a good question. It's a much used and overused term, and it's a term that has become much more common in the time I've been working. When I began working around 1990, it wasn't heard so much, but now it's absolutely everywhere. One might think it had a similar meaning for everyone working in the English language, but it doesn't actually. And for example, the Frieze Art Fair this autumn divides itself into two fairs, Frieze and Frieze Masters. The Frieze Masters goes up to 2000, and Frieze, which is a contemporary art fair, begins at 2000. So that's the last 20 years. In the Tate, when I was the director of Tate Britain, we had a long discussion about how to divide our curatorial teams. And in the end, it was felt quite strongly by the curators that contemporary had to begin around 1965, when practice changed, so that both in art schools and outside art schools, there was no longer any reliance on figurative painting and on the acquisition of skills, but rather on thinking about questions and how they were framed in any media. So our contemporary team of curators, there were 5 of them, essentially began with the 1960s and 70s, when practice changed so much. I think for some people, contemporary is a handy term and they don't worry too much about what it means. For others, it's become a problem, especially because it is very much a contemporary. The contemporary is very much a market term, a commercial term. And you will see in Sotheby's and Christie's, the auctions are termed contemporary art. And so therefore, for them, it has become not so much a description of a radical kind of practice, but rather a marketing opportunity to describe a category of art, which is largely collected, predominantly collected now, as an investment by contemporary collectors. When I was working at the Tate especially, but also more recently at the Gulbenkian in Lisbon, I wanted to think of contemporary in more elastic terms, because it felt to me that with time or in our own time, always ought to include old and new, because we're living with old art at the same time as new art. And one of my interests has been to try and include the two together and think about old art in perhaps new terms, especially asking living artists now to work with older art. And I felt that how we experience Titian or how we experience Bernini now is a contemporary experience, and therefore we can, if we want to, include that within a contemporary program. And I became quite frustrated with listings magazines, for example, and reviews, who tended to review historic exhibitions, modern exhibitions, and contemporary exhibitions in separate lists or separate groups. Whereas a lot of what I was trying to do was to mix them up together and think about the meaning of historic art or modern art in the contemporary day. So I would say that it's become a term, like so many terms, which is so elastic now as to mean not very much, very specifically, but it tends to have still a bit of a buzz about it, which is probably very much driven by the market and by the fact that contemporary art is an investment category, and therefore there's quite a lot of money behind it, much more money than there is in the historic field. And this means that it's also taught much more. So you'll find that art historical courses, art history courses in universities and colleges in Britain largely teach contemporary art only. Historical art is dwindling at the present time, and most students seem to want to study what they see as contemporary art, and that tends to begin in the 1960s.